Deep down, are we devious or decent? Greedy or generous? Your understanding of this question will shape just about all of your political and social views. How often do we hear, well, this is just what human beings are like, therefore what I want is natural? Looking at history, we can argue both sides. Human beings come together to do the most amazing things, but we've also done the most terrible of crimes. So any understanding of human nature cannot be simple. Today I invite you to investigate with me. Who are we deep down? What we'll uncover is the currently dominant understanding of who humans are is seriously flawed, and that there is a new consensus forming in many different disciplines, many different voices, scientists and thinkers and normal people, to give us a clearer understanding of who we really are deep down. And crucially, if we understand ourselves, we can change the society that we live in to bring out the best in all of us. So can we even say what is human nature? Like, human beings do the dance of life in so many different dazzling ways. That is there something that all of us have in common? Well, we do come from nature. We come out of the intelligence of this planet. We share 99% of our DNA with bonobos and chimpanzees. And a humble courgette, we share 60% of our DNA with a courgette. Mad to consider. Billions of years ago, the intelligence of life on this planet worked out the basic building blocks and has been building upon them ever since. So for example, mitochondria, one of the molecules or entities within our cells has worked out how to convert glucose and oxygen into energy. And the mitochondria we find in a courgette and in our cells that make us up. And so the process by which that this intelligence on our planet has become more complex over time is evolution. And yeah, so if we can talk about why, or the fact that a tree has a nature, what all trees have in common, then surely we can talk about a human nature, something that we all have in common because we have a nature. Now it gets complicated because us, more than any other species on the planet, to the best of our knowledge, we have the freedom to choose what we want to do with our biological inheritance. So I can have a craving for a cookie, but I can think, not now, maybe later. To our best of our knowledge, we are the species that has the most freedom to choose what to do with our biological inheritance. And so it gets complicated, but surely understanding our biology is a crucial and fundamental part to understanding human nature today. And yeah, even the question of how do we get this intelligence in the first place? For me to resist a craving for a cookie, where did that intelligence come from? And so why is it that humanity conquered the world? What drove our evolution? Why wasn't a courgette the first species to step on the moon from the earth? Why didn't the chimpanzees make the internet? And why didn't the dolphins cause runaway climate breakdown? You know, understanding our roots and our evolution is a really important part of understanding some of our biggest problems today. And the dominant understanding of how human evolution unfolded and evolution more generally is the selfish gene. And here's a quote from Richard Dawkins: "We and all other animals are machines created by our genes, like successful Chicago gangsters. The successful gene is ruthlessly selfish. Let us try and teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish." So is this how we evolved? Is this our human story? Well, let's find out together. What makes a human human? So you guys will know the rough story of our evolution is that only in the last 10,000 years have we domesticated crops. So we settled down in one place and we started having villages and towns and cities, and then, you know, the civilizations that we live in today. But for the vast majority of our history, we were hunter-gatherers living in small communities and living off the land and hunting other animals and foraging for food. Now, if you were a hunter-gatherer back in the day and you were heading out for the hunt to go catch tonight's dinner, unfortunately, you are far from the strongest or the fastest or the most vicious creature out there. Here's some of the skeletons that archaeologists have found that have been these kind of great megafauna that were alive in the history of human evolution but are no longer alive. So, yeah, you haven't got much chance one-on-one against a woolly mammoth. However, if enough of you come together, then something may be possible. And so, over generations, our ancestors found that working together meant that we collected more food and that we could defend ourselves better. And so those groups that could work together, they survived better. Now, over the generations, we developed a natural social intelligence, and we can think about or leave the how that evolved to later, but we can just simply look at ourselves now to understand just what natural social intelligence we have evolved. And so to give some fun examples, human beings are the only species on the whole of the planet to blush, revealing an internal emotion on our external skin. Out of all of the primates, human beings are the only ones with whites in our eyes. And so, yeah, again, if you imagine a poker player and they're wearing shades, right, because they want to hide their intentions. And so that's kind of like what this chimpanzee on the top is doing, is that revealing where I'm looking and what I want and what my intentions are isn't necessarily a good idea. However, over generations, it's clear that we have evolved to work together because it's become advantageous for us to reveal our deepest intentions. And so if you imagine that you're on a date with someone, how much more intimately connected you are when they look deeply into your eyes and that connection. And we would only have evolved to reveal those deep, sensitive intentions with our eyes if I felt it was safe for me to reveal this information to you. That actually, me revealing this information to you is going to mean that we work together better and understand one another better. And so that is a strong indication to say that we evolved a natural intelligence of cooperation and ultimately compassion, understanding one another and all these subtle cues. And of course today we have language, which is an incredibly complex way in which we can communicate and understand one another. But this emerged out of this natural social intelligence. However, just understanding one another is not enough to have a tribe work cohesively together, because it could be we're out for the hunt, we've killed the woolly mammoth, but then I'm gorging myself on all the food, trying to eat as much as I can, and I can see that you're gesturing in old human speak. Stop eating the food. The children of the elders are back at the camp. They've got the fire waiting for us. Stop eating it all. But I can understand that intention that you have, but then ignore it. So this is the so-called free rider challenge, that within a group, being selfish makes sense. Like, it's great if the group is generous, but then if you can free ride on that generosity, then you're going to be better off than those who are generous. And so to combat this, we developed an intrinsic sense of morality and fairness and a sense of justice. And so a sense of natural morality that meant that we worked well in groups. And we can see this in human beings today. This is a kind of mid-action shot of a child jealous of the attention and the extra love that his brother's getting. I'm sure this is a scene familiar to anyone who's been around children of the need for attention and fairness. And they found this in experiments. So children at the age of 3 will cut up a birthday cake equally. on the whole, they won't give themselves a bigger piece, they will cut it equally. At the age of 6, if another child is given a bigger piece than the child in question, the child would prefer to throw away a luscious chocolate brownie cake instead of facing the injustice that somebody else got a bigger piece of cake without any justification. And so we have a deep, deep, deep sense of morality and justice built into us. And this came out of the need for our ancestors over generations to not only rationally want to work together, but feel like working together is the right thing to do. Another example of this is if you imagine yourself walking in the park and then you suddenly see a child has fallen into a pond. What do? Well, if you're like most people, you run and try and save the child, right? And you do that without thinking or without rationalizing whether or not this child is worth it. You just intuitively, instinctively go over and save that child. And so we have a deep sense of care built into us, part of our natural intelligence. And of course, it's not just human beings. A sense of care is found throughout the animal world, but mainly it is towards those people who are within a chimpanzee family, for example, siblings, or in the very tight-knit and small groups. We, however, in the example of the child, had that sense of care even for those members who were, we've never met that child before, it's a complete stranger. So that is a sense of care really built into us. Bees are another example of a very cooperative species, and the kind of the care for the group. They will almost always sacrifice themselves for the group. So they will literally, we know about bees that if they sting someone, they die, and so they would sacrifice themselves for the good of the group. But within primates, human beings, have this kind of particularly good, and we'll see just how good, care for one another. And so is this just the rational deciding that, this is, I'm going to work, I'm going to decide to be good because that's going to serve me ultimately, this kind of like selfish self-interest that, okay, maybe I will be decent today because it's in my own interest. Well, as Jeremy Lent says, and Jeremy Lent is this wonderful speaker that we explored, thinker that we explored last week, and I really, really recommend his book, which is in the description. He says we don't act morally just because we think we should, but because it feels right. You didn't have to rationally think about whether or not to save that child. And given that children from all around the world have this sense of justice built into them, this is coming out of our natural intelligence. It's not just a conscious, after the fact, emerging property of who we are. So we have some different kind of elements there that may suggest that cooperation is something that is important to human evolution. Over the generations, we developed a sense of compassion and a sense of morality, a natural sense of compassion and morality that came out of the process of evolution. We can see it in blushing in our eyes today, kind of objectively in our body. So cooperation looks like it is part of our story, but just how much of how different is humanity compared to the other primates, who are the other highly evolved mammals that have these big brains like we do. So if you imagine now that you're on a plane and you sit down and you're minding your own business, everyone's just getting on with things, as we can see here. Now, what would happen if instead of the passengers being human beings, they were chimpanzees? According to chimpanzee expert Sarah Hardy, you would be lucky to disembark with your fingers and toes still attached. Bloody earlobes would litter the aisles. So, chimpanzees, they are very intelligent. and you know, they use tools, they have complex emotional and social lives. And just to give you one video, are you smarter than a chimp? That chimpanzees can do memory tests better than human beings can. And so it's not just kind of an emotional intelligence, they have a cognitive and really advanced intelligence. However, as we've seen, stick them all on a plane and they find that pretty tough. Just to give you one more example from Michael Tomasello, another chimpanzee expert. It is inconceivable that you would ever see two chimpanzees carrying a log together. These highly intelligent creatures. But yeah, there's something different about us. So our ability to cooperate is so mundane and everyday that we forget about it. So think about your school, 30 different kids from 30 different families all sitting in a classroom together, learning together. The school made up of 10, 15, 30 classrooms worth of kids. Your workplace, one office of maybe thousands. And then our nations, and then ultimately the complex economic interdependent system that we live in today, encompassing 8 billion human beings. You would never see this as a headline. Breaking news, 45 unrelated college students work together for no pay to prepare for the opening night of Romeo and Juliet. That is just what we do. Human beings are really good at working together. So if we again look at this question, why did humanity conquer the world? Why not the courgettes and why not the chimpanzees? What drove our evolution? Well, there is a growing consensus from many different disciplines, from evolutionary biology to psychology to anthropology, that it is in fact cooperation itself that is our superpower. It is cooperation, not selfishness. That was the thing that really set humanity apart. Taking us from hunter-gatherers, passing down information and learning over the generations to be able to do all the amazing things that we've done. And this is quite a spectacular feat in Spain of human cooperation. So, how different is this from our dominant understanding of evolution, right? The selfish gene, that evolution is this selfish process driven by selfish genes that randomly mutate, and some of the mutations are kind of helpful for our ancestors, and so that gets passed on to the generations, gets passed on. And so evolution in this kind of current understanding, people reject it because it feels so dead and meaningless and blind and depressing that everything is just, fluke chances. But this kind of selfish process. But what we're beginning to uncover is a new understanding of how evolution works. Because is evolution really that selfish? In the words of Rutger Bregman, if only the shameless win, why are humans the only species in the whole animal kingdom to blush? We're told our evolution is survival of the fittest. It seems, however, it's survival of the friendliest. So we're now getting new understandings of evolution coming from wonderful thinkers like Jeremy Lent and Frikov Capra, who look at a more holistic view of trying to understand how we came about. And we find that not only are genes obviously a very crucial part of evolution, undeniably, that is, the kind of the learning of evolution over time is stored within the DNA. And of course, selfishness and competition are inevitable parts of life. But are these the only factors? Because what is beginning to be uncovered is that actually there is a reciprocal relationship between how our ancestors lived within their lifetimes and then what happened to their genetic evolution. So if we take the example of the whites in our eyes, is that that random genetic mutation could only be useful if me revealing more information about my internal world and my intentions was actually received by you, and it meant that we worked together better. And by us working together better, the group survived better. And so it's actually what our ancestors did within their lifetimes with their genetic and biological inheritance that determined whether or not they survived. There's this in kind of evolution, or the kind of materialistic and more atheistic ways of looking at nature, is that all of the conscious plants and animals on the planet today are just dumb biological machines, like we saw Richard Dawkins saying earlier, just blindly being led by Chicago bosses, e.g. the genes. But that is to deny the consciousness and the complexity of every single one of the species that we see on the planet. And of course that was true for our ancestors as well. Another example of how what our ancestors did within their lifetimes then was fed back into our evolution, and we can see it in our biology, is that, you know, over the period of evolution, we were eating fruits, and then we became omnivorous and we started hunting. And so, you know, that's, although, you know, many of us are vegan today or vegetarian because we don't want to harm the other sentient creatures, it is a absolute part of our evolution is hunting and gathering food and killing other animals. But then crucially, as potentially early as 1.8 million years ago, is that some of our distant ancestors worked out how to capture fire, capture fire. And so just to give you an idea, Homo sapiens only came around 200,000 years ago. And so we know this from the fossil record. We can carbon date the fossils that we find. And so we have a rough idea of the different human-like species that were here on the planet. And we have evidence from campfires next to bones of distant ancestors of ash. And so indicating in many different burial sites that actually we had worked out how to use fire. And of course, we know the story with fire is that when you cook food, it makes it easier to digest. And so we could get more calories in with less energy. And so then that was reflected in our stomachs. The guts in us are smaller than they were of our ancestors. You know, if you think about a cow, it's got 4 stomachs because grass hardly has any energy in, and it's got to have 4 times as much stomach space and more than us just to get the same amount of calories. And so if we think about, it was, you know, a tribe of human beings, maybe there was a strike of lightning, a tree was on fire, the ancestors kept the tree and kept it alight. They started keeping it alight and they started cooking their food on it, and they passed down this knowledge through the generations. And so over generations, you know, that amazing intelligence and that creativity and resilience of those ancestors meant that they survived better and then passed down their genes. And so this is called gene culture coevolution. And in the words of Kevin Laland, organisms play active and constructive roles in their own development and that of their descendants. So this is actually a radically different way of understanding evolution than the current dominant form. But we can see when we look more holistically at and there's loads of interesting things that Jeremy Lent talks about, so do continue to explore it, is the reciprocal relationship between genes and the culture. So that's some evidence to say that actually evolution and cooperation is the driver of evolution, for human evolution. Now let us just briefly look at nature more generally and looking at our bodies. And so this is like quite a psychedelic drawing of ourselves. And you know, who are we? We are a collection of 37 trillion cells. Each and every one of our cells, its own micro world, with the mitochondria that we saw earlier, with all these incredibly complex systems. And somehow a whole array, 37 trillion of these individual mini worlds come together and somehow marvelously cooperate to create you. And so you are this kind of walking, ongoing process of relationship. It's not like you are this kind of discrete entity. You are a relationship you are a constellation of cooperation, a dazzling dance of harmony. And so that's who you are. And if we look at other examples, many of us know about the World Wide Web now. We're learning about all this wonderful stuff that's happening beneath the surface of the soil, is that trees in a forest are connected via the fungi. And if a tree gets sick, then the fungi can send nutrients to another tree. They communicate. It's so exciting that actually what we consider just to be kind of an individual tree is actually part of this greater system of relationships. And so you could almost argue that together they are a larger organism. A forest is greater than just the sum of its trees. When there's enough of them, they begin to communicate and to work together. And as Jeremy Lent says, is that actually life, evolution on this planet has, in countless instances over hundreds of millions of years, life has decided time and again that things work better together. And so this really powerful graph that he's created is depicting the story of evolution unfolding on this planet, that the planet being around 4 billion years old and life just emerging just about after the Earth was formed, single cell organisms, and then complex cells, and then multicellular life, simple animals, and then mammals. And we are the most advancedly complicated consciousness on this planet. We are the smartest species on this planet. The wisdom we're still working on, but certainly intelligence. So lots of interesting and mind-boggling and new understandings of who we are. But let's talk about the elephant in the room. We've had a very kind of rosy view of who we are at the moment. However, in the words of Rutger Bregman, canaries don't run prison camps. Crocodiles don't build gas chambers. Never in all of history has a koala felt impelled to count, lock up, and wipe out a whole race of fellow creatures. There is clearly a dark side to us, and it'd be naive to say that we are just completely perfect. But if we've seen that in the course of evolution, it is cooperation that won out over generations, and so we became empathetic and compassionate beings, and working in teams, understanding one another as a fundamental driver of our success. Why can such a friendly creature do such terrible crimes? Well, in terms of terrible crimes, the Nazis, if there's a competition for pure evil, the genocidal fascist Nazis would be vying for the #1 position. And if we look at the Nazi soldiers, so German soldiers fighting in World War II, British psychologists in 1944 wanted to understand why the German soldiers were fighting. The Germans were getting beaten back and they were getting pushed further and further back into Germany. And when some of these German soldiers were captured and put into prison of war camps, British psychologists went in to try and understand why these people were fighting. Were they brainwashed, evil, sadistic killers? What was the reason they were fighting? Well, the #1 overarching reason that these soldiers gave was camaraderie, was brotherhood, not wanting to let their brothers down. And so obviously this isn't to paint a rosy picture of Nazi soldiers, but we can see that actually some of the greatest atrocities in history have been done by those people that have felt like they've been called morally to do what's right for their people, for loyalty, for brotherhood, for fighting for your fellow man and woman. And so this complicates things, and it does seem that deep within us, we have a tendency to divide the world into us versus them. When we have the people who are in the us group, we exaggerate how great they are. You know, people who think and look like me, they are the best. And then the thems, we think they are depraved, and unfortunately our circle of compassion may not reach them because we think they are below our kind of inbuilt morality for caring about one another. And just to show how deep this goes is to look at oxytocin. So oxytocin, you may know as the hormone which bonds mothers and children together. It's this groovy hormone that makes you more compassionate and give to charity more. And so you can imagine if you spritzed it up everyone's nose, that the world would turn into a utopia. However, when a group of researchers in Amsterdam did spritz oxytocin up people's noses, yes, they did find all these wonderful benefits, but only to those people who were thought to be in the group. And so people were more racist and prejudiced against those people who had names that were not in the subject's group. So without the spray of oxytocin, they didn't treat people with different names that differently, but the spray of oxytocin made them more prejudiced. And so that indicates just how deep this us versus them dichotomy is within us. And in the words of Brian Hare, the mechanism that makes us the kindest species also makes us the cruelest species on the planet. That our care and compassion for one another can kind of be like a spotlight where we only identify with our people, and so that then it's easier to generalize people who we consider to be outside of our tribe. So does this all mean then that we are doomed to tribal warfare? We have this deep us versus them button in us, and it's always getting pressed, and so we go into depraved states so easily, and that explains why humans are so bad. Well, again, it gets complicated, because even if someone is considered as a them, it doesn't guarantee that we will treat them badly. And an example that Rutger Bregman uncovers is that in warfare, when they surveyed, only 15 to 25% of soldiers had fired their weapons. You're literally on the front lines, that's your job, shoot the enemy, and only 15 to 25% of soldiers did. There's another great story of a French, in the French army in the late 1800s. They, after the battle, would collect all the muskets, and researchers in the French army wanted to understand, was the gun loaded or not? And what they found is when they opened up all the weapons, that around 20% of the guns that they collected had been loaded multiple times. In these old school muskets, you put the ball bearings in and it takes 5 minutes to load it. It's the longest part of the process. And so to have 2 sets of ball bearings in the gun meant that people without firing were reloading. And one gun even had 23 ball bearings in. So what these soldiers were doing, just to look like they were busy, was reloading their guns just so that they didn't have to shoot anyone. And so, we can feel the kind of the compassion and the humanity for these soldiers who are just normal people that have been ordered by, the powers that be to fight and potentially be killed and try and kill other people and other human beings for something that these individual soldiers didn't really care that much about. Even the Nazis, they only 15 to 25% of Allied soldiers had actually fired their weapons. So we have this kind of aversion to violence, and this goes back all the way even to our hunter-gatherers, is that it's difficult to know how our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived because they didn't carry much stuff with them. However, one thing that has survived down the generations is cave paintings. And out of the thousands of hunter-gatherer cave paintings, none depict war. It seems that war may have emerged from when we started settling down in agricultural societies. So we had private property. We couldn't just move away Because, back in the days of hunter-gatherers, if you had a problem with someone, you could just move on and just keep going. Whereas if you've been on a field for 50 years, you're not going to give that up easily. That's your livelihood. And so you're more likely to fight. And yeah, with private property and inequality, and it's a big story about why war evolved. But it does seem that in our natural habitat, although obviously we weren't angels, and human beings have obviously a diversity of emotions and motivations, and there is aggression within us, that it does seem that the dominant force within us is not violence, but cooperation. Another thing, if we're asking the question, are we going to be in perpetual tribal warfare, is, which is in our favor, is that the tribal borders are always changing. So yeah, maybe a racist person would consider a person with a different coloured skin to be an enemy, or not a me or an us. But if they put the same football top on, then suddenly they join the team. So the shirt becomes the indicator of the group, and the skin is ignored. Obviously, that's not always the case. Racism can still happen. But for us now, our tribes are no longer our ethnic groups and people who look like us and people we interact with, but instead people who think like us, who have our political views, who are part of our same bubble. They're our tribe. And people who go to church or not go to church, who are in our country or not in our country. These borders are constantly changing. Who we consider an us versus them, and so whether or not that button deep within our psychology is triggered, depends upon the stories that we are told about who are the goodies and who are the baddies. Which is good, because it means that our current tribal divisions aren't inevitable, but also bad, because ideologues can use propaganda and charisma to tell you and I that those people over there that are actually basically identical to us are not. They are the enemy. And so with all the terrible things that can come with that. But it goes even deeper than just kind of choosing who's in your tribe and who's out of your tribe. It actually goes down deep to our sense of morality and our deep-seated feelings of who we are and right and wrong. Is that you and we can have this intuitive, deep sense that enslaving people and torturing animals is a bad thing, right? We can agree with that. And that is something that's deep and feels intrinsic to us. However, if you were alive in Roman times, you would have little trouble ordering your slave what to do and then popping out to the Colosseum after lunch and then watching animals and human beings get brutally killed in many different ways. In the words of Robert Sapolsky, our guts learn their intuitions. So these deep held feelings can be learnt. And so another metaphor is that our genes and our biological inheritance are like the outline of a play, and then experience fills in the details. And so, yes, we talked earlier about how we have these intrinsic propensities for care and a sense of fairness, but how these values are activated depends on the experience that then unfolds in our lives, and particularly in this very early part of childhood, between 9 and 12 years old, like when we learn to ride a bike, these moral intuitions become automatic. And so it's like fish in water. If you ask a fish, how's the water today? They'll say, what are you talking about? Because fish is just water is their everyday reality. They don't know any different. And so our morality is the same. So this means that the stories that we tell ourselves can become true simply by us telling them to ourselves. So if we're asking the question, are human beings deep down selfish? That is certainly the dominant paradigm of the economic system in which we all inhabit. It's a dog-eat-dog world, every man for himself. Simply believing these things, we have found, can make it become true. If a child is told from birth, it's a dog-eat-dog world, you better look out for yourself, they're going to act as if everyone is selfish. And so then they perpetuate that understanding. And we see this in our our corporations, psychopaths, those people that don't care about other people and are selfish and aren't empathetic. In the population are around 1%, and yet surveys have found that CEOs have psychopathic tendencies. 4 to 20% of CEOs do. And so these corporate institutions that are running our world based on the assumption that humans are inherently selfish, and the very existence, the raison d'etre of a corporation is to maximize shareholder revenue, not to maximize human flourishing, not to help us grow or to help us live well, but to make money. And so that singular pursuit of profit then rewards these psychopathic people that don't care about one another. And so our understanding of human nature then can give us some glimpses into some of the really core roots of our environmental and social crises. So, bringing this together, what is human nature? Deep down, are we greedy or generous, saints or sinners? We now know that question is woefully simplistic, that to try and contain the complexity of who we are into binary categories is simply not possible. But what we have found is that actually, rather than selfishness being the core of human success, in fact, cooperation is our superpower. We have developed a natural intelligence, a compassionate sense of understanding one another, and a morality for fairness and for care that's really deep within us. However, we also grew up in tribes with limited resources, and so that compassion could only extend so far. But the power of the human mind mean that these us versus them categories are malleable and are culturally determined. And so the stories that we live in will then determine how these basic natural instincts manifest in the world. And so in some ways, this is a synthesis of more conservative and liberal positions. Conservatives in general, they talk about the need to educate morality of their children, say thank you, and for the parents to lead by moral example. And it does seem there is some value to that because it indicates to the child what this society values. However, you cannot separate the goodness of that child or the goodness of that adult, and ultimately human beings in general, from the world in which they live, the stories within which they are told, and the sort of life chances that they are given. If a child grows up in a broken home and they are told that human beings are selfish and this is constantly reinforced, then of course they're not going to be able to show the same compassion or cooperation for their fellow human beings. Of course they can break out of that deep psychological conditioning, but it makes it much more difficult. And so you and I, we are like plants. If you put a plant in soil that doesn't have enough nutrients, it will wither and struggle. If you put it in soil that will nourish it, it will flourish. And so culture determines how our nature is activated, for better or for worse. And so human nature is up to us. What can we do to set up society to bring out the best in our nature? And some ideas to think about with this is, compassion, extending it from just this parochial, we are the superior people, but actually realizing that all of life is we are deeply connected, and as we've seen evolutionary, we come from the same source. We are relatives in a real and meaningful sense. And the source of our environmental problems is we see nature as a resource to extract, as if there's little Lego blocks out in the world just to burn and use. But if we began to extend our compassion to all sentient creatures and realizing that, we share this planet, and to respect the beauty of all the other plants and animals, is that perhaps that could then begin to help us, activate the sense of compassion. Violence is another thing, is that, you know, violence isn't inherent. As we've seen, hunter-gatherers, they could move on. War wasn't the only option. And so, you know, war is no longer an option for us. With nuclear weapons, it guarantees total destruction. And so we need to change. You know, I get a bit kind of moralistic of seeing like, army movies, and just like the amount of violence that's in them, that we're kind of celebrating this violence. Could it be that we kind of, the stories that we start telling ourselves is that we have passed, transgressed, left our violent past, and that it's no longer an option for any sort of resolving conflict. You know, we can resolve our differences in other ways. So yeah, compassion and care and peace, these are things that if we actually begin to talk about these things as fundamental to what it means to be human living today, then these can be integrated into the stories of who we are. And we've seen that can then be, have powerful effects on how we set up society. So that is our exploration of human nature. I hope you enjoyed. I'd love to get your thoughts in the comments and the chat. I will come to you briefly. And yeah, a really different journey, different understanding of ourselves in so many different ways. We've looked at a new form of evolution and found that actually cooperation, not only in humans, but more generally, has been what life, the intelligence of this planet has realized is actually, more constructive. Cooperation is won time and time again. And then we saw that even although we have this us versus them dichotomy in our brain, that we don't even need to necessarily activate it. That the power of the human mind means that perhaps, we were taken out of our natural habitat. We went on this kind of traumatic journey of becoming agricultural societies, and warfare and slavery and colonialism, and today the challenges and the uncertainty we feel about the future. But maybe this was needed. That happened from generations of humans learning about the world. We have this intrinsic curiosity and then sharing what we learn down the generations, and we've become incredibly powerful as a consequence. But maybe now, we integrate this power and this intelligence with wisdom, and we can actually, use and bring out the best in all of us.